Hello, this is Dennis Polis with another response to HonestDiscussioner.
Dr. Polis keeps contending that we've been working at the hard problem of consciousness and continually failing for over 400 years.
Of course, I never said continually. What I was saying was that the problem has been worked on since the time of Hobbes. But actually the problem goes back to the time of Democritus in the 5th century BC. So we've been working on it for over 2,500 years.
The little work we've done since the invention of the MRI has yielded promising results.
Even though consciousness is unified, there is physically no place in the brain where all of the information comes together to demonstrate and underpin that unity. Thus, the little work that has been done since the invention of the MRI completely undermines the naturalist position that consciousness is a brain function.
Though what Dr. Polis has done and is continuing to do here is argue from ignorance.
On the contrary, I'm arguing from many kinds of data. I just showed how functional MRI data supports the thesis that the brain is not responsible for the unity of consciousness. In addition, naturalists completely ignore the data from our own conscious experience. As Chalmers has pointed out, there is no way in which external observations can tell us that an individual is conscious. It is only because of our own individual personal experience of being aware that we know that such a thing as consciousness exists.
Since we don't have the most difficult problem of the mind completely figured out yet, that means he can submit an untestable theory that he can tailor to explain the gaps in our knowledge.
There are many points to be made here. First of all, naturalism itself is an untestable theory. It is the theory that there is nothing outside of the kinds of things that physics studies, that there is nothing outside of matter and motion. Yet that theory is something consistently rejected by the majority of mankind. So surely it is a hypothesis, and it is an untestable hypothesis. Secondly, the only kinds of theories which need to be tested are hypothetical theories. Theories which are deductive, which are based on premises which are known to be true, do not need to be tested. We don't test whether 2 plus 2 is 4. We deduce that 2 plus 2 is 4, and then know that it applies in all possible physical cases. The same thing here. Parts of the theory which I am proposing are deductive. Other parts are hypothetical. This brings me to the third point. And the third point is that my theory is testable and in fact conforms to the data from over 1,000 experiments which show that human intentions can modify the laws of nature.
Even though he has to twist some facts around to do it. There is no evidence for the two-subsystem mind theory because there can't be any evidence for it. Whatever this second subsystem is, Polis has made it clear it isn't physical, and therefore isn't testable.
What I said was that our intentional subsystem is not the brain. That doesn't mean that it doesn't play a role in physical motions. The laws of nature are not material, but they certainly play a role in physics and in physical motions. Our intentional subsystem is just like the laws of nature. It's intentional, and they're intentional. It controls the brain to some degree by its intentionality. This has been confirmed experimentally. That is to say, the fact that intentions can control physical processes has been confirmed by over 1,000 experiments, as I keep saying. Yet HonestDiscussioner keeps ignoring it.
The only way it can be falsified is if we can entirely explain consciousness from a physical standpoint.
Of course, my theory would be falsified if intentions had no physical effects. There are philosophers who support the idea of causal closure. That means that physical processes can only be affected by other physical processes, and not by intentionality or mental processes. The data I've been discussing falsifies the idea of causal closure. It could have gone the other way. My theory could have been falsified if it turned out that intentions had no causal effects, if our intentions could not modify physical processes, but they can. Another thing which could be done to weaken, if not to falsify my theory, is to come up with a plausible physical explanation of how consciousness could occur. In the 2,500 plus years that the theory of a physical origin of consciousness has been floating around, not one single viable physical hypothesis has been made. In this following clip, he's discussing a quote in which I skipped over, but put on the screen, some text from Chalmers' book.
And now he's arguing that he skipped over the part about there being good evidence that consciousness arises from physical systems because it is irrelevant to the no progress claim. This is incorrect. It is very relevant to the fact of there being evidence for physicalism.
HonestDiscussioner apparently doesn't realize that Chalmers is not a physicalist. Amazing. He's a dualist. Yes, he's a dualist. He spends 2 chapters showing that mental facts do not supervene on physical facts. That is to say that consciousness, in Chalmers' opinion, and he presents very strong arguments, cannot be deduced from any physical facts. His theory is that there are psychophysical laws which act on the brain to produce states which are not physical states, but which are mental states, and that these mental states are distinct from and not reducible to physical states, that the laws which produce them are not logical, but are new laws yet to be discovered. And he believes, as I do, that the brain, together with the laws of physics, will not produce consciousness.
It just doesn't mention explaining how physicalism works. If I have good reason to believe that a black eye was caused by a baseball, but I don't have an explanation of how the black eye could have caused the black eye, that doesn't remove the fact that we have reason to believe the baseball caused it.
Unless we have some evidence to show that the baseball hit the patient in the eye, or that something similar happened, so that we have some idea of how the baseball was connected to the black eye, we have no evidence that the baseball caused the black eye.
Dr. Polis doesn't go over this evidence. Dr. Polis goes on by attempting to refute my analogy of appealing to the flying spaghetti monster and intelligent falling by saying we have good evidence for gravity. Right, but there are aspects of gravity we don't understand. We don't have a detailed theory of quantum gravity, for example.
So isn't it better to have a provisional model which accounts for all of the data than a model that accounts for half the data and an unfulfilled promise to account for the other half of the data at some time unspecified?
My analogy still holds.
A man who abandons the empirical method in his own belief system by holding a priori that only certain kinds of reality exist could hardly be expected to understand the scientific method. When beta decay was discovered to violate the conservation of energy, momentum, and angular momentum, we postulated the existence of a neutrino which was so weakly interacting that it could penetrate 40 light-years of lead with only a 50% chance of interaction. Many naysayers said that this was magical thinking. Yet, in time, neutrinos were discovered, and their existence has been confirmed experimentally. So, a provisional model is one which makes a hypothesis which can be tested, but which is not yet confirmed. There is no model of consciousness based on materialism or physicalism. Yet when someone such as myself rejects the a priori notions upon which physicalism is based, then people like HonestDiscussioner, who are unfamiliar with the scientific method and who are closed to the new possibilities, invoke ideas like the flying spaghetti monster. I'm sorry, if we accepted your analogy, we would reject the entire scientific method.
Dr. Polis again tries to say I have no evidence for my belief in physical brains causing consciousness. Yet we do see a correlation between what happens to the brain and awareness.
I don't ignore in any way the physical data showing that disturbing the brain and our neural processing disturbs the contents of awareness. It disturbs the contents of awareness. If we have faulty data processing, the result will be faulty output. We will then be aware of faulty output. We need not conjecture, as naturalists do, that it is awareness itself which is affected by the drugs or the physical disturbances and traumas which affect the brain. We need only say that the processing is interfered with, and as a result the output is distorted.
Dr. Polis, though, has no evidence for his claims. He only argues from ignorance that we don't know everything about consciousness.
Of course, I'm not arguing from ignorance at all. I'm arguing from logic which shows that the assumptions of materialism and physicalism are totally incapable of producing the marks of consciousness. So the logic here is that which is familiar to readers of Sherlock Holmes. If you rule out all of the other possibilities, and all of the other possibilities here are those suggested by materialism, then what is left must be true. And what is left is that there is an immaterial subsystem which is responsible for awareness. Let's briefly discuss some of the evidence. First, it's logically possible that there could be beings exactly like ourselves, but which have no consciousness. This is called the zombie argument. The idea is that there are beings which speak and act just as we do, but inside of which there is no conscious awareness. Physicalism is incapable of distinguishing zombies from people who are actually conscious. So consciousness is a fact on top of all of the physical facts. It is a non-physical fact. This is an argument used by Chalmers and others to show that physicalism is inadequate to reality. I also brought up Dennett's book, Consciousness Explained. Dennett assumes materialism, and then argues that if you assume materialism, all of the data, all of the experience that we have of being conscious is an illusion, that it is impossible. We can assume materialism, as he does, and that all of our experience is wrong and illusory, or we can be empiricists, as I am, and conclude that materialism is a faulty assumption because it disagrees with experience. I also showed in subsequent videos ideas are a completely different kind of sign than those used in computers and in the brain. I also discussed the possibility that the mind could be a kind of computer, and I showed that the computers do not represent data in the same way that minds do. So my theory is based on sound experiential reasons for rejecting physicalism and materialism. It is not based simply on the fact that materialists have failed to come up with a theory of consciousness in 2,500 years. The fact that they've failed to come up with a theory of consciousness is merely an indication, a sign, that they are incapable of doing so.
He then goes into how he hasn't seen a model of consciousness yet, even in recent years. Unfortunately for him, we are not talking about entire models of consciousness. We're talking about progress towards showing that awareness is a product of physical systems. We have made progress on that point. Polis then contends that he gave evidence for his two-subsystem mind. His evidence is to say Daniel Dennett has shown no naturalist model can explain consciousness. How Dennett has done this is not fully explained, and without reading Dennett's entire book, I can't really respond to that. Suffice to say, not all naturalists agree with Dennett, and from what I can gather, neither do I. The other evidence that he gives is that you need two systems to have a theory of mind. One to process content and one to be aware of the content. So therefore the other system is an intentional non-physical system. Dr. Polis believes free will is derived from our intentionality, being able to warp the laws of nature. He cites a meta-analysis or two that tries to show that random number generators and dice throws can be affected by thoughts. I hoped these studies were true, because if they were, it would utterly destroy free will, not to mention his entire theory. If I can use my intentionality to control the neurons in my brain, we can do that to anyone else. I'll give you meta-analysis, but respond to the point which undermines your entire theory.
He doesn't understand what a system is. A television, for example, is a system. All of the parts are integrated. If you put another television set next to it, if it's not properly shielded, it might even get some signals from the first set. That does not mean that the picture on the second set is going to be controlled by the picture on the first set. Systems have a certain degree of integration. The intentional part of my humanity controls the physical part of my humanity, and it may have the side effect of affecting but not controlling objects around me.
I'm going to bring in my special guest refuter.
The mind can exert intentional control over the laws of nature, with the effect being about 1 part in 10,000. 1 part in 10,000 doesn't seem like a very large effect. However, the brain contains 10 to the 11th neurons. Thus, an effect of 1 part in 10,000 corresponds to controlling 10 million neurons. Given that the brain has evolved as a control system, and that the nature of control systems is to use small inputs to control large outputs, this is more than adequate to control our body and behavior.
Yep, according to you, Dr. Polis, a small amount of interference is what controls the brain. Dr. Polis is engaging in special pleading. He argues your intentionality can control your physical system, but it can only affect other systems. And he gives no basis for this distinction.
The basis for the distinction is that my physical makeup and my intentionality are part of a unified system, a single human person, myself. Your intentionality and your physical makeup is part of a different system. Even if I were to grant HonestDiscussioner every point which he thinks he's made, it would not, as he says, utterly destroy free will. Free will means that we have choices sometimes, but not necessarily always. So the fact that we from time to time have acts which are not free does not in any way undermine free will. So even if I were able to completely take over and control another person, to possess them demonically, as it were, that still would not undermine the other person's free will. That person would still have choices. The person could choose to cooperate, to remain neutral, or to resist. So even if we granted HonestDiscussioner's worst-case scenario, it still would not undermine free will.
He also believes, according to the comment section, that we can affect people's thoughts and get them to take actions they would not have taken had you not affected them.
What I was discussing was not taking control of another person, but inputting data to which they could respond. If I yelled the person's name, that would be affecting the person. The person might choose to turn in response to hearing his name called or her name called, or she might not. So if I were to give someone the feeling that they were being looked at, they have a choice of ignoring that feeling or of responding to it.